Hi there, my name is Robin, and I'm making this video to share with you a document I wrote that outlines a strategy to form a bioregional governance. So basically this is it in one visual image. There's essentially three components to a bioregional governance, the way I define it. One is, and it starts with, rhythmic sacred gatherings. From rhythmic sacred gatherings emerges two emerging fields with three components each. One is the political commons, and the other is the economic commons. Out of the political and economic commons comes a bioregional land trust. When you have all three of these components together, rhythmic sacred gatherings, political and economic commons, and bioregional land trusts, when all three of these are represented, then you have a bioregional governance. So what I'm going to do is describe in more detail what these things are and how they fit together. And that's essentially what this document is. The writing of this came into being while I was kind of interfacing with two different things. One was Concow Meadows Research Station, which is a project I'm a part of out here in the Western Sierra Mountains in Northern California. Essentially, what we're doing is we're looking at how to implement permaculture projects on a bioregional scale, how you integrate kind of the community and culture and practices around ecological stewardship into the model of bioregional permaculture. So that's one of the two influence areas. The other thing I was involved with was online community around cryptocurrency. The Autopia community is who I connected with. And from that community, my eyes kind of opened to all of the tools that are emerging on the digital commons and how they might be utilized towards bioregional governance. And so the tools that I'm thinking about are cryptocurrency, open badges, and kind of learning spaces. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the details of this larger concept. So I'm going to start by describing rhythmic sacred gatherings. I'm going to go into the details, the three components of the political commons and the 3 points of the economic commons. And lastly, I'll describe a bioregional land trust and how that brings everything together and grounds it into place. Okay, here we go. So first off is the rhythmic sacred spaces. The reason I think this is an important place to start is because when people gather in the sacred, they're bringing a certain foundation to the relationships, a certain quality that is different. It really allows people to open up the kind of cultural field that they're in, kind of like the norms and ways of conduct that we normally think of in kind of this present day reality. And by entering a sacred space, we're creating the opportunity to invent new kinds of relationships where we're coming from new kinds of places. Rhythmic sacred spaces also have the added benefit of allowing people to meet each other in little small teams that cluster together and form, so that the people with the right backgrounds and kind of complementary skills can come together and form these small teams that can work on some of these smaller projects around bioregional governance. Before I move forward, I just want to make one note of the Regenaissance, a meta-modern playbook. This is a really neat document that goes into a lot of detail about the history of sacred gatherings and kind of their historical role in human culture, and looking at what it might look like to reintegrate some of these themes into kind of the emerging cultural and governance spaces that we can invent nowadays. Yeah. Okay. So that's that. I'm going to leave it there. So we just went over rhythmic sacred spaces. Now we're going to go into the commons, the political and economic commons, starting with the political commons. Okay. So, the commons. There's two parts to the commons, the political commons and the economic commons. The political commons consists of three distinct components: a bioregional constitution, a decision-making process, and the third is dispute resolution / innovation process. So let me start with bioregional constitution. The reason why a bioregional constitution is important is because it dictates the agreements everyone's making on what is ethical to them, how they're going to interact, just kind of like the norms that they're creating, that they're identifying with, of like, this is acceptable behavior, this is not acceptable behavior, just kind of like creating some boundaries for the community and culture. Within a bioregional context, it's important when thinking about the Constitution to think about how the non-human members of a bioregional community are represented. You know, how is the water represented? How are the snails represented? How are the snow geese represented? How are the soil biota represented? In order to represent these things, we need to have really deep pattern literacy around the biologic members and their niches and their flows and interactions with other members. And what I propose is that there needs to be groups of people who can actually study and speak with these different communities and speak on their behalf. So, for example, a community that is really focused on the snow geese, we get the Pacific flyway snow geese around here. The community that could speak on their behalf, the geese's behalf, would be the ones that really go in depth and understand what their niche is, what they need in order to continue their life. When there's like when a niche has been taken away, they need to be represented in the governance. So that's just a little bit about bioregional governance. Next is a dispute resolution / innovation process. The reason why these are in one category instead of two categories is because they're both dealing with the same issue, which is addressing challenges in novel and innovative ways in order to find solutions. It's important when thinking about bioregional governance to have methods to solve problems and innovate solutions laid out. This is also a really important area for surplus capital to be reinvested in the system, so that innovation processes, experiments and such, and also just like space, people who can hold space for resolving conflict and building more awareness in people in conflict. Those processes are really essential for kind of a community to be able to be effective with evolving their process and kind of deepening their relationship with the land and each other. The third component of the political commons is a decision-making process. We're always making decisions, whether we have a process or not. Having a shared decision-making process makes more awareness possible for how to make decisions. And here I just want to note the work of Richard Bartlett. This book, Pattern for Decentralized organizing has really excellent design features it describes in terms of decision making. One thing that's quite interesting is to consider asynchronous versus synchronous decisions. What are the decisions we need to make in person, in conversation, and what are the decisions we can do online that can create a lot of efficiency in the decision-making process? Okay, so that is the political commons. Now we're moving along to the economic commons. The economic commons. So if the political commons are the kind of like game rules, then the economic commons are more like the tools. Like I give an example in this thing, like an example of the political commons is 3 strikes and you're out. An example of the economic commons is a bat, a ball, and a glove. That's a baseball analogy. But essentially, the economic commons are more embodied units for offering, exchanging, and that sorts of things. And so there's 3 components to the economic commons. The first is a unit of exchange. This is like a coin or a token or some sort of currency. Some process by which the community has a medium of exchange encapsulates the culture and creates economy and culture between kind of the participants in the system. Yeah. What else do I want to say about the exchange? I guess the only other thing I want to say is, like, you might ask, why bother making an alternative currency when you could just use dollars or something like that? And the kind of cryptic answer I have for that is that a currency and the economic model that is embedded in it comes with it certain cultural norms in the operating system. And like, for example, in our current economic system, externalities like the cost of clean water and dirty air, which is in the commons, these things often aren't included in the value of the product. And that has to do with the way that we function in our system, but it also has to do with how connected or disconnected we are to our local ecosystem, in that we can understand, if we're able to view the patterns around us, we're able to understand what products are regenerative for the lands and what actually cause negative feedback loops in the ecological system. Okay, so that's one of the 3. The second of the 3 included in the economic commons is credentialing. Online in the digital commons, this is often referred to as open badges, and the essential idea is that there's some way that you can testify or certify that someone has gone through some sort of learning or rites of passage or some kind of process that makes them have more expertise or trustworthiness in whatever field the credential is describing. Today, the places that offer credentials are universities primarily, and now you're starting to see alternatives on the online world. But essentially, what I'm suggesting is that credentials should be decentralized, where anyone has the opportunity to offer certification through whatever kind of process they want to offer. It doesn't mean that all credentials are equal. It just means that they can't be quantifiably compared. They can only be qualifiably compared, which means that there needs to be more relationships amongst the different people involved, so that that, for example, the disciples of somebody who's offering credentials have a general aptitude for what their credential represents, that their skill sets are. Yeah, so that's credentialing, and credentialing is really coupled with the last component, which is a process for healing and learning. And here too, you'll notice that I put the institution of education and the institution of healing or medicine in one category. And the reason that I did that is because it's my belief that they're both incomplete without each other. So for example, going through a healing process without learning is incomplete, and going through a learning process without any kind of healing is incomplete. So when these two approaches are coupled, you get a stronger, a more real, a more authentic, and important to society offering. I need to close the damper on the stove 1 second. So that was the last component of the economic commons. So far what we've looked at is rhythmic sacred gatherings, the political commons, the economic commons, and then that all climaxes into a bioregional land trust. Okay, bioregional land trust. So a bioregional land trust is important because it actually takes some of these practices and governance models and relationships that have been forming through these rhythmic sacred gatherings and these connections and this organizing that's taking place, that evolves and forms until it has a location or series of locations to ground it into place. A land trust offers an opportunity to integrate these concepts into physical landscapes. One thing I want to point out that's a bit distinct about what I'm calling a bioregional ecological stewardship land trust and a regular land trust, like an ecological land trust, is that I believe that having skills around managing or stewarding the commons, tending to the commons, is an essential part of the ecosystem at this point. We're in the era of Anthropocene. Humans' impact has been so potent that we're actually required in order to bring the system back into balance at this point. And so what ecological stewardship land trust does is it rebuilds the skills around stewarding ecosystems, which has to do directly with the relationship between the humans and the ecosystem they're embedded within. Okay, so what is the deal with a bioregional land trust? What are its components? Okay, so there's 3 elements as I see it to a bioregional ecological stewardship land trust. They are learning labs, also known as, you could think of them as a research station. They are common lands, and they are wild lands. So think of it this way. The learning labs are where there's the most human interaction. This is where there's villages being built and designed and researched. There's small industries being developed, and there's all kinds of research being done on ecological stewardship. So what people do to make the landscape vibrant and balanced and healthy. That all happens in this primary zone. So it's the most highly managed. And you can think of this primary zone, the learning labs, as a series of research stations where people are either researching how do you design regenerative human villages, how do you design regenerative cottage industries, or how do you actually implement regenerative practices on the ecosystem just to put it into balance so that we're being good stewards. All of these approaches should be approached from a scientific methodology, meaning that you're testing hypotheses in order to gain better knowledge. So what ends up happening is they have an iterative approach where you try and you learn, and then you learn from your mistakes. So it's constantly evolving and self-improving its process. So that's the learning labs. Really after this, I haven't even finished writing, so I'm going to explain them. Just kind of where I'm thinking about it so far. And if you want to give any kind of feedback on this portion or any of it, this is kind of a working document, and any kind of feedback would be graciously appreciated. Okay, so the first is these learning labs, which is the most managed. Outside of the learning labs is the common lands. And this is areas where people from the learning labs, you have all of these teams that are working on their own projects. So there's like all these little laboratories in the same region, and they're all learning stuff together in these little labs and sharing information amongst them. And every once in a while, they'll do larger projects where they'll leave their little labs and go to the common lands to do larger landscape restoration projects. And these larger landscape restoration projects are essentially a temporary version of the first component, the learning labs. So there's temporary villages that are set up, there's temporary industries that are built, and there's temporary landscape restoration that's happening. So how I imagine this happening is, like 2 months out of the year, a bunch of people from like the little villagey area, they all go out in the mountains, make these temporary camps, and they do land management. Some of it has to do with thinning forests, and the wood used from thinning forests can be milled on site, and there can be artisans on site that are making furniture or value-added products, but not just like cheap value-added products like firewood, but like really high quality craftsmanship level value-added products. And then you have the ecological stewardship happening through thinning, through earthworks, through compost teas and soil revitalization, through holistic grazing, through planting, all sorts of ecosystem restoration activities. And then at the end of those 2 months, people pack up and they leave. And so they've left the space in a better ecological position than before they got there. They were able to practice their crafts and industries and go home and have products to sell in order to fund these projects. This is also a time of celebration and sacred gathering when everyone leaves their small places and comes together. It's also a bit of a festival, and it's another opportunity for practicing coming together in the sacred and the relationship and the heart centering that people can do together. The last part of the land trust is the wildlands. And these are the places that are really far away, that are seldom accessed, and just really small little expeditions of restoration are done, but it's left with very little human input. And that's kind of where you just let it be and do its thing. So yeah, those are the 3 phases. There's the learning labs, where there's testing and experimenting and team building. There's the common lands, where you have these crews that congregate on the wildlands for these festivals that are about 2 months long, that result in regeneration. And last, you have the wildlands, which is kind of like no person zone. So this is the general idea. This is the overall concept. The vision is essentially that if you go through these steps, starting with gathering in the sacred, moving to building political and economic commons, and grounding it in bioregional land trust, you then have all the components for an active and acting and self-evolving bioregional governance. So that's it. Love to hear feedback from you. Thank you for listening, and please take a look at the document that is attached to this video in the description. for more details. Okay, bye.